The Goblet of Fire book contains many incredible moments that never made it on screen in the adaptation, but perhaps none of them rank as highly as the creation of S.P.E.W. For those of you who've only watched the movies or just don't remember from the books, this organization was one of Hermione's first attempts at leadership, government, and battling social injustice as she sought to end the mistreatment of house elves in the wizarding world. This committee is an underlying theme and subplot in the entire Goblet of Fire book, and it leads to some major discoveries during Harry's 4th year. Unfortunately, S.P.E.W. and over a dozen other critical moments from these chapters in the book were removed in the Goblet of Fire adaptation. In the book, there are multiple chapters before we get to the Triwizard Tournament itself, and it's a shame that we don't get to see them in the film, which is why today I'm going to be going page by page and scene by scene, revealing every change the movie made to these chapters in the book. We'll talk about S.P.E.W., Mad-Eye Moody's actual first class, and much, much more. My name is Gibby, and welcome to episode 47 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, Harry Potter Edition. Before we dive into the action, I wanted to give a shout out to this commenter from my last video, which was all about Harry Potter myths that fans still believe. If you haven't seen that video yet, be sure to check it out when you're done watching this one. And if you want to potentially be featured in my next video, leave a comment below with your thoughts on this week's episode. Per usual, we'll cover all the changes across the 4 major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's recap what happened during this very brief scene in the movie. Although there are about 3 chapters worth of information before the Triwizard Champions are picked in the book, the movie only gives us a 5-minute scene. Picking up with where we left off last week, we see Mad-Eye Moody begin teaching his first Defense Against the Dark Arts class, and he tells the students about 3 unforgivable curses. Ron shares the first one, and Moody puts the Imperious Curse on a spider-looking thing and makes it fly around the classroom. Afterward, Neville gives the second curse, which is the Cruciatus Curse, and Moody tortures the spider with it. And finally, after Hermione yells at him to stop torturing the creature in front of Neville, Moody brings the spider over to her and asks for the final spell, which she refuses to provide. But that doesn't stop Moody, who casts it in front of her anyway, killing the spider with Avada Kedavra. We then cut to after class as the trio exit the room and then bump into Neville on the way down some stairs. They ask how he's doing and he barely responds, but before they can continue, Moody interrupts and takes Neville to his office for some tea. And that is where scene ends for this week. Pretty short, right? Well, since we've got so many critical and exciting book moments to cover, let's waste no time and jump right into our first 3 categories of characters, timeline, and location. As for characters, this week we have a pretty massive amount missing. This is probably because it's the start of school and all of Harry's old friends, teachers, and more are being dumped onto us in these chapters. The movie obviously focuses on our main trio, but here's a quick lightning round of everyone who is missing. And yes, I understand that we briefly see some of these people in the shots in the movie, but I'm naming them here because in the book they actually have speaking parts that never made it into the film. So here they are. Professors Sprout, Trelawney, McGonagall, and Hagrid, Hannah Abbott, Lavender Brown, Draco Malfoy, Dean Thomas, Parvati Patil, Fred and George, Lee Jordan, Ernie Macmillan, and Sirius Black. Now, besides those people who have speaking parts in the book, we have a few other characters who are only mentioned, but we don't see in the scene. Those would be Peeves, Wormtail, Lupin, Dumbledore, Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, Rita Skeeter, Madame Pomfrey, Professor Snape, Vector, Binns, and Flitwick, Eloise Midgen, Cedric Diggory, Filch, and Lockhart. If you're new here, don't worry, most episodes aren't as jam-packed with missing characters as this one is. But like I said, it's the start of the school year and a lot of these characters are being reintroduced to us in these chapters, as J.K. Rowling refreshes our memory on the main cast of the story. Now moving on to an easier category, we have timeline. And when I say easy, I more so mean that there's less variances. However, the couple of changes we do have are quite large. First, in the book, Durmstrang and Beauxbatons have not arrived yet. They won't arrive until our next episode. In the book, we learn how they don't show up until October 30th. So Harry gets a whole 2 months of school without them. And our second change is the fact that in the book, Mad-Eye Moody turns Draco into a ferret on the first day of school. We'll talk about why and the plot changes, because that whole interaction is way different from the movie. And obviously, if you're familiar with the film, then you know that we won't get to that scene for a while longer. Finally, to wrap up our first 3 categories, we have locations, which, similarly to characters, is jam-packed, especially because we read about 2 whole months of Harry walking around Hogwarts, whereas in the movie, we're just stuck inside the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom. Instead of going through and naming each individual room of the entire castle, I'll just sum it up by saying this. First, we miss out on pretty much every classroom, and second, we miss out on Hogwarts locations like the Great Hall and other main spots like that. Now, before we dive into our plot changes for this week, I want to give a shout out to Jason, Cody, Joshua, and the rest of my incredible Patreon supporters who make videos like this possible each month. If you'd like to get behind-the-scenes content, early access to videos, and more, feel free to join using the link in the description. With that being said, let's jump into our crazy list of plot changes. Starting off, we're picking up in Chapter 13 as we learn about Harry's first day back at school. This chapter is titled Mad-Eye Moody, but surprisingly, it's not the chapter in which we learn about Harry's first class with this enigmatic new teacher. That comes in Chapter 14, which is titled The Unforgivable Curses. So to start our changes for this week, we must first go over the big omissions the movie made by removing the entirety of Chapter 13. First, we miss out on breakfast. I know that might seem basic, but it actually is an important transitional moment in which we get into the swing of things and learn some key details. We read about our trio enjoying their breakfast in the Great Hall and reading over their new course schedules. Ron says that they're outside for most of the day, starting with herbology and care of magical creatures, but then later they have double divination. Harry groans about this as he is not a fan of Professor Trelawney, who tells him that he's gonna die just about every time she sees him. Also, Ron makes a comment to Hermione about how she doesn't seem to be boycotting the food anymore as he watches her slather jam onto her toast. She tells him that she is thinking about other ways to stand up for elf rights. Remember, the night before, she refused to eat anything at the opening feast after finding out that about 100 house elves are responsible for making the food at Hogwarts. Before they can continue that conversation though, owls fly in for the morning and Harry gets distracted because Hedwig still hasn't returned with a reply from Sirius regarding his scar. This worries Harry as he isn't too sure what has happened to Hedwig or Sirius since he sent that letter a couple weeks back. Harry carries this somber mood from breakfast into their first class with Professor Sprout, which brings us to our second large change to this chapter. And that would be the removal of the trio's first 3 classes of the year. We read about them heading into herbology and learning about bubotubers, which are thick slug-like plants needing to be squeezed for their pus, which is highly valuable. It smelt horrible, and Harry barely got through it as Sprout had them harvest the pus for Madame Pomfrey. We learn that bubotuber pus is great for acne, and we hear about Eloise Midgen, who tried to curse her acne off and ended up needing to get her nose reattached. If I'm not mistaken, Eloise Midgen is later referenced in the movie during the scene in which McGonagall teaches Ron to dance. So I guess the movie took inspiration for poor Eloise's acne from this class here. Anyway, after herbology, the Gryffindors had care of magical creatures with the Slytherins, and they went down to Hagrid's hut. This is where we get introduced to an amazing creature called a blast-ended Scroot. And when I say amazing creature, I really mean disgusting and dangerous. But you know Hagrid, always falling in love with the discarded creatures of the magical world. We read about their class as they took care of these deformed, shellless lobster-looking things that would randomly explode, burning anything near their backside. After all, there's a reason they're named blast-ended Scroots. Hagrid has the class try to figure out what to feed them as he doesn't properly know, so he gives them a few types of food and leaves them to it. Per usual, our golden trio take to defending Hagrid, despite not wanting to do anything with these creatures. Malfoy, as always, makes fun of Hagrid and whines about the task of taking care of the magical creatures, but Hermione sticks up for Hagrid. Later, she tells Ron and Harry that she only did that to defend him, and in reality, she actually agrees with Malfoy, and thinks that they should stomp on a lot of these creatures before they decide to attack everybody. Finally, to wrap up their first day of classes, Ron and Harry have divination. Remember, Hermione gave it up the previous year, so she went to a different class. In divination, Trelawney gets up to her usual antics and predicts Harry's downfall. By the end of the class, Ron and Harry have annoyed Trelawney so much with their jokes and side comments that she ends up giving them extra homework, to the dismay of all of the other students. But as we'll see later, the boys find a genius way around this extra work. Now moving on to our next removal, we come to a pivotal change in Malfoy's ferret fiasco. Like I said earlier, Mad-Eye Moody actually turns Draco into a ferret in this chapter, not later on in the story like the movie shows. But the first change here is the removal of what Draco says to Harry and Ron first. In the book, as the trio are heading to dinner, Draco pulls out a copy of the Daily Prophet and loudly starts talking to Ron so that all of the other students around them can hear. He then shows Ron an article which includes Ron's dad. It's yet another article from Rita Skeeter, who is writing more about further mistakes at the Ministry of Magic, and references Arnold Weasley, who helped Mad-Eye Moody earlier in the week. According to Rita, the Ministry once again found that Moody had raised a false alarm, and there was no need to involve the Ministry. Then Draco shows a picture on the front of the paper of Molly and Arthur Weasley, and he makes a crude comment about Mrs. Weasley's weight. Harry holds Ron back from lunging at Draco, and then he asks about Draco's mom, and if she's got dung under her nose or if she just always looks like that. Which brings us to our next change, as Draco, of course, is always up for dishing the insults, but can't take any himself. So as Harry turns away, Draco fires a spell at him, which misses. And it's after the spell is fired at Harry that Moody intervenes and turns Draco into a ferret. In the movie version of this scene, Moody attacks right as Draco is about to draw his wand, but in the book, Draco has already fired a spell at Harry. Another change here is the fact that after McGonagall comes up and stops Moody from bouncing Draco around, he takes Draco to see Snape. We sadly don't get to see this interaction, but it's much different from the movie version, which shows Draco and his goons just running off. And in the book, Moody is very happy to take Draco to Snape, as he says that he's been meaning to pay him a visit anyway. After Moody leaves, the trio get their food and Hermione quickly eats so that she can go to the library for an unknown reason. Then after she leaves, the twins and Lee Jordan come up to Harry and Ron and they talk about Moody. They seem to be in awe of their new teacher, and they say that their first defense against the dark arts class was unlike anything else. Harry and Ron see that they don't have that class for a couple more days, but they're extremely excited to begin. That ends chapter 13, and the next chapter picks up with telling us that nothing crazy happens for the next couple of days, unless you count Neville melting his sixth cauldron as exciting. We also learn that Snape is afraid of Moody for some reason, which has put him on edge. And then finally, we get to their first class with this new professor, and this is where the scene in the movie comes into play. But it really isn't all that accurate. The first change regarding this scene is the fact that Moody calls out Lavender Brown, not Seamus. During the start of the lesson, Moody's magical eye catches Lavender showing Parvati her completed horoscope under the desk. Remember, they're the only two students who actually care about divination. After being called out, Lavender embarrassingly puts her horoscope away and Moody continues. Which brings us to our next change, as the Imperius Curse in the book is displayed quite differently than in the movie. Obviously, the movie version is funny and involves multiple people in the class as the bug bounces around the room, but in the book, it's a lot simpler than that. We read that as Moody puts the spider under the spell, it starts doing backflips and tricks like it's in a circus. It doesn't fly around the room onto people's faces, but rather keeps doing tricks on its table, at one point even getting up and doing a tap dance. To be fair to the movie, I think I'd choose the movie version over the book version here. The only unrealistic part is the flying around thing, because it gave the impression that the Imperius Curse could make things float. But other than that, I like the movie version. Next, Hermione actually raises her hand and willingly offers up the killing curse. For both of the previous curses, her hand had shot up to give the answer, as she always did in all of her classes. For the killing curse, she was a bit slower, but she still offered it up, giving Moody the go-ahead to perform it on the spider. This is completely opposite from movie Hermione, who refuses to raise her hand or speak when Moody asks her for the final curse. And finally, the last part of this specific class that the movie removed is a key detail which impacts how we view the killing curse itself. In the book, Moody explains that the killing curse isn't easy, and the words alone don't make it work. He says that all the kids in the class could point their wands at him and say Avada Kedavra, and he wouldn't even get a bloody nose. He then goes on to tell them that he isn't there to teach them how to do the curses, but rather how to defend themselves from them. However, he adds that the killing curse is the only one that they can't defend themselves from, but it's important that they know what they're up against. Now moving on from this lesson, we've still got a whole chapter's worth of content to discover here as the movie continues to cut loads of information, including S.P.E.W, which is coming up soon. The next detail I want to mention is a smaller one, but one that I think is worth discussing, and it's that Harry's reaction to seeing the killing curse is a lot different than the film. In the movie, they show Neville really being affected by seeing the Cruciatus curse, but we don't get the same vibe from Harry. However, in the book, Harry is definitely put off by this class. At one point, Ron is going on about how cool Moody is in the class, but then he cuts off because he can see Harry is affected by the discussion of the killing curse. It's a brief few paragraphs, but it continues to show how Harry is seriously affected by the night his parents were murdered, especially since the previous year he got affected by the Dementors who brought the vivid memory back to him. Next, another small omission is the detail of Neville's herbology book, which was called Magical Water Plants of the Mediterranean. After Harry and Ron get back to their common room, Neville shows it to them and says that Moody lent it to him. This, of course, is where Neville later gets the idea of gillyweed for Harry, which the movie waited to introduce until much later. But J.K. Rowling planted the seed now, pun intended. Next, we come to Harry and Ron's divination homework, which is a funny moment in the book as we see them act like true schoolboys trying to cheat on their homework. You really feel for them because they were tasked with predicting their upcoming week or whatever, which we know really is impossible. So they decide together to just write down the most horrific and depressing things possible. They put things down like drowning, being sick, burnt, stabbed, or even decapitated. Later on, we read that Trelawney eats up this homework and praises them for bravely embracing their unfortunate circumstances. But sadly for them, she gives them another month of the same homework since they did so well the first time. But anyway, that happens later on. Our next omission brings us to a short moment in the common room as Harry and Ron overhear Fred and George talking with each other in a mysterious and secret way. Harry overhears them mention something about needing to be careful and accusations of some sort. He wonders if it's related to them trying to enter the Triwizard Tournament, but this is the first of many hints the book will drop about their own secret organization, which we'll later know as Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. But that's for a later episode. For now, we can get into the introduction of S.P.E.W, which, as we've mentioned already, was sadly removed from the entire Harry Potter series, despite being a central element to this year's plot. For those of you who don't know, S.P.E.W stands for Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare. After finishing their homework, Hermione comes into the common room and reveals 50 badges she's made that all have S.P.E.W written on them. She then tells the boys that the reason she's been sneaking off to the library so much is because she's been researching elf enslavement. Ron protests that the elves like their jobs, but Hermione is adamant, and she forces the boys to pay their 2 sickle membership fee, which happens to get them a badge. Hermione then tells them that their short-term goals are to secure fair wages for the house elves and better working conditions, and long-term she wants to get them access to wands and a spot in the Ministry of Magic. This is just the start of a long and detailed subplot in which Hermione is dedicated to freeing these elves from a position that they don't want to be freed from. And it will lead to many revelations regarding Harry's own journey this year as well. But seeing as it's a touchy subject, I think the movie decided to cut it all together to save time and the hassle of dealing with the topic of slavery. Especially since in the wizarding world, the elves of Hogwarts really do seem to like their jobs. But again, this will continue to be unpacked later on in the book. And we still have a few more omissions to cover before we wrap up today's episode, as the removal of S.P.E.W was only scratching the surface in regards to this week's differences. Next up on the list is the removal of Sirius's reply to Harry's letter. It comes while they're in the common room talking about S.P.E.W as Hedwig taps on the window and Harry lets her in. Here's what Sirius wrote. I'm flying north immediately. This news about your scar is the latest in a series of strange rumors that have reached me here. If it hurts again, go straight to Dumbledore. They're saying he's got Mad Eye out of retirement, which means he's reading the signs, even if no one else is. This upsets Harry greatly as he now feels like he's endangering Sirius by making him come up north where he could potentially be caught and arrested. So Harry goes to bed angry with himself and the next morning decides to try and write Sirius a quick letter to let him know that everything is actually alright. As you can guess though, Sirius doesn't buy this lie and decides to come up north anyway. Next, we have another massive omission in terms of plot anyway, which is their second Defense Against the Dark Arts class. This is huge. In the book, we read about their continued studies in which Moody teaches them how to resist the Imperious Curse. He one by one puts them under the spell and tries to have them resist the commands he gives them. Everyone fails except Harry, who somehow fights off Moody's directions. Well, kind of. Moody tries to get him to jump on a desk, and Harry does like a half-jump thing which causes him to fall to the ground. Still though, he resisted it better than any of his classmates. Anyway, our second to last omission is the announcement of Durmstrang and Beauxbatons arriving at 6 o'clock on Friday, the 30th of October. A large poster is hung up with this announcement, and everyone at Hogwarts obviously gets excited again for the Triwizard Tournament. They also learn that their classes on Friday will end a half hour earlier, which makes Harry and Ron very happy as that day they have Snape. And all that week leading up to the visiting school's arrival, the teachers and students seemed to be on edge as they cleaned up, decorated, and made every student look near perfect for their guests. And that brings us to the last change of this week, which is the omission of their final breakfast before the new schools arrive. It seems only fitting that we start this episode with a breakfast and we'll end with one as well. During this breakfast, we learn about another moment in which Fred and George are whispering about something amongst themselves. This time, Ron tries to ask them what's up, and they tell him to go away. They then get wrapped into a conversation about house elves once again, as Hermione brings up that Hogwarts A History makes no mention of the 100 house elves who take care of the castle. Fred and George then ask Hermione if she's been to the kitchens, and she tells them that she hasn't. They then go on to say that they have because they steal food there every once in a while, and they've spoken with the house elves. The twins go on to say that the house elves love their jobs and Hogwarts, but Hermione refuses to believe them, saying that the house elves have been coerced and manipulated into thinking they like their positions. And before they can continue arguing, the book moves on to that night as the new schools arrive. And like I said, that's something that we'll cover next week. But now that you've heard all of those omissions, small to large, let me know which one you think is most impactful to the story. Leave a comment on how you would rewrite the movie if it were up to you. If you enjoyed, be sure to like and subscribe, and check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next video.